Welcome everyone, whoever's here today. As you're joining, I'm just going to note that it is recording. And we're going to start in a couple minutes. Oh, fine, Diana. I'm talking to myself. Welcome. As people are joining, I just want to share that we're recording this session and we'll get started we'll give 2 minutes for people to join. Yes, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Aline Fader and I'm the zoning project coordinator for the National Zoning Atlas and also a co-director of the New York State Atlas. For anyone who's unfamiliar with their work, the National Zoning Atlas is a collaborative of researchers digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing US zoning codes. We are housed at the Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, and we're located in the Legal Constructs Lab under the direction of Sarah Bronin, who along with Ilya Ilancu developed our unique methodology for gathering data about local zoning laws. We have over 20 teams across the country using this methodology so that policymakers and regular people can easily identify the legal constraints that shape how buildings are built in their communities and to better understand the large impact these sometimes Byzantine laws have on things like, why is there so much traffic? How flood resilient or not is my community? And why do homes cost so much? I encourage you to check out our website at zoningatlas.org to learn more about our work. Today, we are very excited to have Kendall Cotton, President and CEO of the Frontier Institute, to present his findings and experiences putting together the Montana Zoning Atlas, which is our second ever published state atlas. Excuse me. It was released in January of 2023 and has been an amazing success in terms of supporting an impressive amount of housing policy reform for Montana. The Frontier Institute is a nonprofit organization that works towards reducing red tape, promoting fiscal responsibility, reforming healthcare, promoting responsible forest management, and expanding educational access in Montana. Kendall was born and raised in Montana and has over 10 years experience working in the broad realms of public policy. Welcome, Kendall.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. I'm going to invite him to take over and share his prepared remarks, and then I'm going to pepper him with a few questions. And then we will field any questions that you all choose to leave in the Q&A section of Zoom. With that, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Kendall.
Sure. Well, thank you. All right. Well, thank you for that great introduction. And it's been a pleasure to work with the National Zoning Atlas Project. And as was mentioned, get some serious reforms, pro-housing reforms done here in Montana this spring. So we're obviously thrilled by the outcome of this project and looking forward to sharing with you kind of how we went about it and maybe some helpful tips and strategies for other states to take on. So if you want to advance the first slide. So just a little bit about our organization and the perspective that we bring to this conversation. We are focused on solving problems with more freedom, not more government. Other organizations might be advocating for tax credits and new government programs to support housing, but we're as an organization interested in where our niche is focusing on where government gets in the way of people building homes or getting into an affordable rental. And we work with others. We build coalitions. We bring in experts to break down those barriers. Next slide, please. One of the ways that we approach problems, big problems, public policy problems at the state and local and even federal level is kind of through this decision matrix here. And this is something that I encourage lots of policymakers when they're addressing issues to think about things this way as well. The first question we always start with is, okay, is there entrepreneurs already solving this problem that we're seeing in the marketplace? Is this already being solved? And especially with the housing conversation, there's clearly a big problem. We're not building enough homes to meet demand in Montana and a lot of other states across the country. So the next question should be, from our perspective, okay, what state or local level policies are standing in the way of a private market solution of building enough homes? And so that's where this conversation came into play with the Zoning Atlas Project, looking at all the strict local zoning regulations that were standing in the way of building homes. And then once we've sorted out that conversation, then we can start looking to the federal level and say, okay, what are the feds doing that are preventing us from building the homes we need to build and from building the affordable types of homes that would be accessible to people of lower and middle incomes. And then after we've done all of that, then we can go back and start looking at, okay, what can the government actually do here to support people getting into housing? I think that the conversation was almost flipped mirror image here for a lot of folks in Montana about 2 years ago. There was a lot of interest in subsidizing housing and doing different development projects sponsored by the government. And one of the problems that they were running into is that no matter how much money they were spending on this problem, it kept getting worse. And so we took on this Montana Zoning Atlas project to hopefully demonstrate to state and local leaders that zoning regulations are a big problem in this housing conversation, and they must be addressed in order for us to get our hands around this housing crisis. Montana, in the past few years since the pandemic and really the explosion of remote work, it's kind of been discovered. There's lots of folks moving here from New York and from California who can now work remotely, and they're choosing to live in Montana. And that's putting a lot of pressure on Montana's housing market. Our costs have doubled in the last couple of years in a lot of areas. In Bozeman, Montana, which is a college town, that's where I went to college, the median home price there is nearly $850,000 right now. So there's a big problem in our communities because regular working class folks are getting priced out of some of Montana's premier cities. And it's also leading to a lot of this sprawling development where you can't build in the cities, so they're sprawling out into open land in the countryside. And so the question on a lot of Montanans' mind over the last 2 years has been, okay, how do we make sure that as we grow, that Montana doesn't become like California? How can we avoid that fate where housing is expensive? Only seems like the rich people are able to get into a house or own a home, and there's miles of urban development. That's a future that no Montanan wants to see. And so when we started looking at this issue, we noticed that there was there's a lot of different aspects of zoning regulations that prohibit and prevent the creation of affordable types of homes. And we noticed that there's a lot of skepticism from local and state leaders that zoning reform was even a viable strategy to address this housing crisis. So next slide, please. We created the Montana Zoning Atlas Project. And really our mission was to provide very clear data on a map, in a visual way that would demonstrate to state and local leaders that, look, these strict zoning regulations we're seeing in our cities are a big problem. And one of the reasons why we're seeing such a bad housing crisis in Montana. And then also use that to inform some of our policy decision-making about how we can actually address the housing crisis. So next slide, please. So we honed in, and this is kind of unique to Montana because Montanans have, a special hatred, I guess, for anything California. And we honed in on this concept of, if you look at California cities, you saw that they had, really this exclusionary type of zoning. And it was something that California cities really were a part of pioneering back 100 years ago. Places like LA, pioneered this concept of reserving vast portions of a city through zoning for only single family style homes, the most expensive type of home to build, and prohibiting the really the affordable starter homes like duplexes and triplexes that are truly more affordable by design. They're more affordable to build and end up being an option as kind of a first rung in the ladder of home ownership for young families just starting out, buying their first house, workers just moving to town and getting their foot in the door in the community, or renters as well. And so we labeled this California style zoning. And this was kind of a way that we were able to demonstrate, just how bad things have really gotten in Montana. So next slide, please. One of the things that we found after we did our research through the Montana Zoning Atlas Project is that vast portions of Montana cities and counties, for that matter, are reserved, just like California cities are, only for the most expensive types of homes, single family homes on big lots. And they either outright prohibit or penalize the more affordable multifamily starter homes like duplexes or like accessory dwelling units, things like that. And that is a really big problem when we have this massive population influx and we need a place to put all the people moving here. It's going to put constraints around our housing market. If you go to the next slide, we'll dive into the how this actually looks on the ground and how we were able to really visualize for state and local policymakers how zoning actually works to exclude the most affordable types of homes from our communities. So if you go to the next slide, this is an example of Missoula, Montana, one of our largest cities, one of our most in-demand cities. This is where a lot of folks have started moving to during the pandemic. It's a city actually I grew up in, and you'll see on this map here that the pink areas indicate where 2-unit or more family homes are outright prohibited in Missoula through zoning regulation. It totals out to over 75% of the primary residential areas in this city. That's a big problem. Only 25% of the city allows the construction of the most affordable types of homes. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, so what you see here in the blue is where duplexes or townhomes or more units are allowed by right. So there's no discretionary permit process. There's no public hearing required. It's simply just an administrative process. The city checks the boxes and makes sure that your development comports with the city's regulations, and then you're good to start building. Only 23% of the city. If you go to the next slide, even less welcome, triplexes or greater by right. And that's an even greater problem as we look at accommodating even more population that's moving into this city. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we see how layering on top of each other all the different types of strict zoning regulation, because zoning isn't just about outright prohibiting things like duplexes. It also is involved with regulating the size of yards and how big your yard can be in relation to the home you build, or how far back your house needs to be from the sidewalk. So all of these different types of zoning regulations, when they're added on top of each other, can actually have the effect of prohibiting homes too. So here you see the pink areas coming into play. And this shows where even in areas that are theoretically, they allow for duplexes and triplexes and that sort of thing, the minimum lot areas required to build those types of homes are bigger than the existing lots. And so this essentially what we call creates de facto single family zoning. So you can't build the affordable types of homes in the pink areas. So if you go to the next slide, when you total that up, that leaves only 23% of the primary residential areas in Missoula. Over 2/3 of or 3/4 of the city is outright, excludes the most affordable types of homes. So this was one way that we were able to go in and really show step by step what some of the problems were with these strict zoning regulations, particularly around minimum lot sizes, and how, as you layer on top of each other, all of these strict zoning regulations, how that actually leads to housing being excluded in our communities. So if you go to the next slide. Now, here's the really scary thing. We compared what Missoula looks like to what Los Angeles looks like. And Los Angeles is eerily similar, 74% single family zoning. So when we were able to show a map of Missoula side by side with a map of LA and show people and lawmakers especially that the zoning maps of those cities are almost exactly the same, people really started to get concerned. Because like I said, the worst fear of people in Montana is that we're going to become like California and lose kind of the specialness that is what we enjoy here in Montana. And what we said is that if our cities are zoned like LA, we can expect them to grow like LA. So in 25 years, if Missoula keeps growing on the pace that it is, we're going to see it sprawling out into the countryside, taking over all of the open land and rural areas that make Montana a special place and areas that we all enjoy in Montana. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that our Zoning Atlas project was able to do is also demonstrate that this isn't just about a single city. A majority of the cities in the state also have embraced this strict California style zoning where the majority of the city is reserved only for the most expensive types of homes. So here you see Whitefish, which is another very fast growing community. Whitefish is at prohibiting two-family homes in over 63% of the primary residential areas of the city. Next slide. Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman was the city that I mentioned that has homes right now at a median home price of $850,000. Well, half the city is reserved only for single-family homes on big lots. Next slide, please. Kalispell. This city is a city at the gateway of Glacier National Park. And this is where a lot of folks are moving to right now. It's one of the fastest growing counties. And over half their city is reserved only for single family style homes. Next slide, please. Billings, this is our largest city in Montana. Over 57% is reserved only for single family homes. Continue. So this is where it gets really interesting. Helena, Montana is the state's capital. And in 2019, city leaders actually, in an attempt to address the housing crisis, they voluntarily got rid of minimum lot sizes completely. And they legalized duplexes in all the residential zones. And so, as you can see from this map, their duplexes are permitted in 100% of the residential zones in the city, and they don't impose any minimum lot sizes, zero, none. And one of the things we were able to point out is that, if you look at the home prices in Helena, Helena is still a very fast growing area in comparison to the rest of the state. And if you look at the home prices in Helena and you compare that with the home prices that we're seeing in Bozeman and Missoula and some of these more strictly zoned cities, there's a wide disparity. Helena is much more affordable. And so this was kind of one way where we were able to show that, hey, there's something to this, and zoning reform can actually work to address affordability in this state. Next slide, please. So with our zoning atlas project, we really focused on comparing and contrasting the cities. While our kind of overall metrics for the state were useful, what was really impactful was being able to go in and tell legislators from a particular city that their city is worse on duplexes or accessory dwelling units compared to the other city down the road. And so we were able to chart out comparisons for each of the major cities in the state, and in terms of what types of housing they allowed and what percentage that is allowed in their city. Next slide, please. We also were able to demonstrate that cities vary widely with the types of zoning regulations that are in effect. So as I mentioned, Helena doesn't even have minimum lot areas, but places like Missoula and Bozeman definitely do. And so, really providing this data and providing this comparison is a way for us to overcome some of these arguments where, people just have this proclivity to say, well, this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's got to be. And you can go in and show people that, no, look, Billings reformed their code, Helena reformed their code. This isn't the way it has to be. Next slide, please. So when we published this first iteration of our zoning atlas, we really sparked a pretty robust statewide discussion. We actually had newspaper editorial boards weighing in and calling on their local leaders and state leaders to say, hey, something needs to be done here because this is clearly a problem. We also had, a lot of great reactions from, local mayors and city council members, when they were actually able to see the extent of their zoning regulations mapped out on an interactive format where they could go in and zoom in on their house and what type of zoning was allowed around their house. It really crystallized some of the problem here. And I think we were able to overcome this skepticism around zoning reform as a viable strategy. And we really crystallized this issue as look, this is something that we can address right now today that will help us address this housing crisis. Next slide, please. So one of the really great things here in Montana was that our research, after sparking kind of this statewide conversation, led to us being included in this housing task force that Governor Gianforte convened last summer. And this was a fantastic group of people. The governor brought together folks from the left, from the right, folks who are representing the cities and counties, folks who are representing the building industry, in grassroots groups. So this was a very diverse task force. And one of our missions was to dive into solutions that the governor and the state legislature could implement to address some of these strict regulations that we were pointing out in the cities. We published a series of reports that provided particular recommendations for lawmakers, state lawmakers, to implement that I'll talk about later have eventually now become law in Montana. And the research in our Montana Zoning Atlas project was actually incorporated into the reports of the Housing Task Force, and really were used as somewhat of a justification for why we were making these recommendations in the first place. Because prior to then, there just wasn't any good data to show that zoning reform was needed, and we were able to provide that. Next slide, please. So from there, this really kickstarted for us the beginning of a really great coalition that we've been able to work with for the last year and a half to get these housing reforms across the finish line. So we, put together a group of people that was very diverse, people that, our organization as a free market organization doesn't typically work with. So we had, obviously we had, folks who were small scale developers trying to build these infill projects in cities. We had, representatives from the building industry associations and the different industry groups, but we also had, folks on more left-leaning grassroots activist groups who are advocating for affordability in their communities and representing, renters and low-income workers and that sort of thing. We were partnering with those organizations. We had Mark Egge, who's one of my great friends. He was a former member of the planning board in Bozeman, and he's a passionate advocate for transportation reform and making cities more walkable and friendly to bicycles and things like that. And we were able to work with him. And so we had this vast, diverse coalition that we were able to build, and that was really excited by the research and the data that we were able to provide, because it gave them arguments to go to their communities and advance their advocacy as well. So next slide, please. We were really fortunate to have the governor's leadership on this issue too. The governor was, like I said, he was particularly interested in addressing some of these strict regulations that we had pointed out in these local cities zoning codes. And he was very open to not only hearing from us and our coalition, looking at our research, but also, inviting us to the table and inviting others to the table to call lawmakers' attention and say, we need to pass some of this legislation. Here you'll see I'm at a press conference with Governor Gianforte, and that lineup of people there is definitely not the usual suspects. I guess I'll put it that way. Republican city council members standing alongside self-professed Democrat socialist city council members and a developer and a former Democrat lawmaker. We just had such a diverse coalition that we were able to build, but because we had such, concise, clear data, we were able to say objectively that no matter what perspective you're looking at this from, you can all agree that zoning is a problem. Next slide, please. Our research was also used for a lot of promotional advocacy during the legislative session to reach the public and tell them to tell their lawmakers that they should vote for statewide zoning reforms. Americans for Prosperity was canvassing neighborhoods and putting up door hangers on people's homes, directing them to actually back to Frontier Institute's Montana Zoning Atlas to get more information about zoning in their community, and also to go call their lawmakers and tell them to support some of the bills that have passed. We were also able to point to some of our research and develop really interactive videos that we posted to TikTok that, just exploded and got tons of views, of an audience that, we weren't really connected to, kind of the younger crowd and the college kids. Next slide, please. So I'll spend a little bit of time here talking about what actually happened. So these are all bills that have officially been passed. Montana's legislative session is officially done. So these bills, one of them has actually been signed already, but these bills have passed and are on the governor's desk. Senate Bill 323, Senator Jeremy Trevas approached us, wanted to work on some of these strict regulations that he was looking at from our research. And we partnered with him to craft this legislation that essentially legalizes duplex in cities of 5,000 or greater. We also tried to innovate a little bit compared to some of the reforms that are passed in other states and say that let's try and address some of the tiered zoning that essentially penalizes building a duplex. So for example, a place like Missoula, Montana has a per unit minimum lot size regulation. And that's something we found out through our work with the Montana Zoning Atlas. And so when we were crafting this bill, we put a provision in that said zoning regulations imposed on duplexes cannot be more restrictive than what's required for a single family lot. So that was an attempt to address some of those types of per unit restrictions. That bill has now actually been signed by the governor. So that bill has an effective date of January of next year and is going to officially be in effect. Senate Bill 382, this was referred to as the big bill this legislative session because it truly is a big reform. It completely overhauls Montana's land use planning statutes. And really what it hones in on is this concern where public hearings are the place where projects go to die, really. And we all know that by being involved in the housing discussions. That's where all of the neighbors come out and say they don't want this housing project in their backyard. So what this big bill, Senate Bill 382 does is it actually front loads all of the public hearing process to the planning phase. And so once the zoning or the growth plan's agreed to and the zoning map is created, there'll be public hearings about that to get input. But then after that's done, and we've all agreed to the rules of the game, now all housing development will be approved through administrative review. So it's essentially making housing approved by right statewide. And that's a big deal. So that's going to do a lot to speed up development and get us to a place where we're building the homes we need to build. It also requires local governments to actually set a goal for how many houses they need to build in a certain amount of time to meet their projected demand for housing and adjust their zoning maps to actually accommodate that population growth. That's one of the problems we're dealing with right now. And this was something that we actually helped craft as a part of this bill, is it establishes a menu of really specific pro-housing zoning reforms that the local governments have to select from to encourage housing development. That's things like eliminating minimum lot sizes, eliminating strict parking requirements, easing up on multifamily and mixed-use construction, raising building heights, things like that. One last thing to mention for that bill that I think gets overlooked is that it also requires manufactured housing to be treated equally with regular stick-built housing. And I think that that's a big deal because manufactured housing from our Montana Zoning Atlas research, we definitely found that sometimes manufactured housing is relegated to like a single district in a city. And that's really unfortunate because manufactured housing truly is some of the most affordable types of homes that people can get into, and they don't look all too different from the traditional single family home. So that should be allowed. Next slide. All right, Senate Bill 528. This we were really excited about. This actually requires municipal governments to allow at least one attached, detached, or internal accessory dwelling unit. And it also addresses some of what we call poison pills that local governments have used to prevent ADU construction or ADU creation in communities. And these were things that our zoning atlas methodology was able to tease out. And so, this was something that we were aware of after completing our research. And Senate Bill 528 makes sure that cities aren't requiring ADUs to be owner occupied. They can't mandate additional parking for an ADU on top of what's required for the home. They also can't assess additional impact fees for this development. If you're just converting your basement, you shouldn't be penalized for it. So we think that this bill is really a great bill, and I've heard a lot of good things about how this compares to other ADU legislation nationally. Senate Bill 245. This bill is focused on the mixed use multifamily development in commercial zones. So this bill, broadly restores the rights of landowners in cities 7,000 and up to build those types of developments in commercial zones. And it also prevents local governments from mandating more than one off-street parking spot per unit. One of the things we saw in the Montana Zoning Atlas is that a lot of the commercial zones will allow for, a apartment to be on the second floor of a commercial building, but they require a public hearing in order to get that done. And we've seen very high profile events in our communities where people come out and they oppose the development. So allowing, restoring the rights of landowners to build this stuff, allowing it by right is going to be a big deal. Next slide, please. Okay, I guess I'm done. So you can obviously go check out our Montana Zoning Atlas directly on Frontier Institute's website. But you can also always check it out too on the National Zoning Atlas Project's website. And I'd be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendall. That was fantastic. Congratulations to you and the team on a very successful build and launch of this data set. Since you actually launched in January, we have had at least about 10 new teams that are starting up. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps share some of the key lessons that you learned with other new teams, especially around, you talked a lot about a lot of relationship building and behaviors that really led to the success of this one. I'm wondering if you could give some insight onto your lessons learned and best practices there.
Yeah, well, so on the coalition building front, I definitely want to encourage anybody embarking on a zoning atlas project to work with anybody who's interested in the housing conversation. Be open to working with diverse groups. That was something that really was our strength in Montana. We were able to work with that diverse coalition that I mentioned of groups that, we really hadn't engaged before. But we found I had a lot of fun working with those and building bridges with those new communities. And it will only be an asset the more diverse coalition you build. The next thing I would say, as far as best practices on research, as we started diving into the research, we had an expectation of how much work was going to be involved and what it was going to take to actually put together this really comprehensive map using this methodology. And as we dove into the data, we were surprised many times with the way that different cities treat zoning and just how diverse and different the zoning codes are, even just 20 miles down the road. So I definitely encourage anybody who's doing the Montana Zoning or a National Zoning Atlas affiliate project to collect the zoning files sooner rather than later. So go out to your communities that you're wanting to build a map for and get the GIS files from them early on, as soon as possible. Get the zoning codes saved in your hard drives. Be looking at the map early on, because that's going to allow you to troubleshoot any problems down the road. We definitely had a few times where once we had all the data collected, but then once we opened up the actual GIS documents for the zoning maps that were saved by these cities, we were surprised. And there was a bunch of new zones that we had to account for that we had no clue about. An example I'll tell you is, some districts, they consider planned unit developments to be an overlay district. And that's totally fine. That's consistent with our methodology. But we found that other jurisdictions consider it essentially treated as a legitimate zone in and of itself. So not an overlay district, even though they say it's an overlay. So that's something that is kind of just a discovery process that folks will learn as they go.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself, that the words used to label a district are not necessarily representative of what the district actually is or does. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about politics. I think that is the big story here with this atlas, and you managed to do something that is, quite frankly, almost unheard of in today's like political arenas. So the data you produced put forward this sweeping pro-housing legislative changes, and you had bipartisan support. Can you speak about the kind of groundwork? Like, how did you get those people on board with you? How did you build those bridges to kind of, put together that coalition?
Well, I think it really started with just having this clear data. We developed a tool essentially that all of these activists who had been working in these, Montana's a big state. We're 4 or 5 hours away from a lot of these cities, so all of us were in our own isolated, areas working on the same problems. And the data that we were able to provide by the zoning atlas was, a lot of people told me, oh, this is exactly what I needed to go and talk to my city council, or this is exactly what I needed, to go talk to my legislator. And so really it started with the research. We were able to produce something that was highly valuable and that really drove the conversation around what the problem actually is. And so that led to opening a lot of doors with some of this coalition. Now, as far as, focusing on kind of the politics of it, I definitely, and we were talking about this early on before the webinar started. There's some of the zoning atlas work I've seen, focuses on the state level statistics, and that's great. But one of the things that we really focused on was really comparing and contrasting the cities. And we found that was, at least for Montana's political environment, where you have a Republican-led legislature and statewide office, and then you have some of these more left-leaning Democrat-held cities, that was a really effective way for us to, essentially shame some of these cities that haven't been doing their jobs to address their zoning codes, and give the Republican legislature some firepower to go in and say, well, you guys have been saying to us for a long time that you got this under control. Well, here's a map that says you clearly don't. So now is the time for us to step in. And so, yeah, we actually went in and built I went through kind of the slides there that showed, step by step how, as you add zoning regulations on top of each other, it leads to excluding the affordable types of homes communities. We built that slide deck for each city that we measured, and we sent it to their city council and we sent it to their legislators. And we think that by focusing on the particular cities, it was one way for us to localize the argument enough where it led to some action.
That's great. I'm gonna, we have a couple questions come in, and we're running low on time, so I want to get some of these in. Andreas is asking, he says that the Senate Bill 528 seems big indeed. What is your recommendation for municipalities with ADU regs that require owner-occupied properties?
Yeah, I mean, my recommendation, I guess, would hopefully be pass something like we did at the state level, but I know that's not viable for a lot of states. So, one of the things we heard during our conversation with the legislature, some of the pushback that we received on that bill in particular was, well, this is just going to open up the door for short-term rentals. And all the ADUs that are going to be created are just going to be converted into Airbnbs for rich people. And, that was something that we had to overcome. And I think that we overcame it really with providing a lot of personal stories. If you personalize the ADU conversation, ADU is a wonky term. And for a legislator, especially in Montana, we have a citizen legislature. They're just farmers and ranchers. They don't understand what an ADU is. But if you talk about, putting building an apartment over your barn that you'll rent out to somebody, they get that. And so if you can talk about those kind of scenarios in a very personalized way, we were able to overcome this idea that, this bill is only for the big greedy corporations that want to, buy up a bunch of investment properties and create Airbnbs. We were able to say that's not true. The people who are using that are people who are converting their basements or building an apartment over their garage so that they can stay in their property and so they can pay their property taxes and their mortgage.
Or house their parents as they get older or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
We also have a question from Jason, who says, thank you for this project, and I'm super interested in learning how to do this in Florida. I'm not sure how to start going with it. I'm only me, and I'm not working with any program or institute. Okay. So Jason, Diana is on. She's not going to answer right now, I don't think, but we will get in touch with you and we will help connect you and see if we can help you start working on a Florida Atlas. We are very interested in getting Florida up and going, because that is, I think they also had a very good successful run of statewide legislative changes to promote affordable housing. But yeah, that is a prime area that we're looking to get going. I guess I'll close it with one last question, which is what's next? Many of the teams are kind of thinking about the long-term maintenance of this sort of data set. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what Montana is going to be up to in that realm.
Yeah, this is definitely something that, needs long-term maintenance, and we think it should be updated, especially after all of these zoning reforms get implemented. We can see just the drastic changes in the zoning maps. That'll be pretty cool. I'm going to be on some of the working with some of the interim committees in our Montana legislature. And, one of the things that I realized throughout this Zoning Atlas project is that, this is a service that really the state should provide. I think that the state creating a statewide zoning atlas will be beneficial for developers who are coming into the state. They want to build homes, but it takes time to go in and understand all the inner workings of all these different cities and county zoning codes. If we had a statewide, consolidated database that was, even hosted by the state itself, I think that'd be so beneficial, and it's in the public interest. So that's something that I think is an opportunity. The other thing I would say too is that our hope is that other organizations who want to expand our project, we only looked at 13 counties. There's definitely more counties that probably have zoning in Montana. The zoning looks a little bit different in Montana. We have a lot of empty areas that don't have any zoning at all. But it definitely would be worth it to expand our project. And, that's one of the reasons why we've really appreciated the National Zoning Atlas's methodology and data being open to the public. This is something where we want to collaborate with anybody and everybody who wants to help us expand this project, maybe take the reins from us and, do the data collection for more counties in Montana. There's also other aspects of zoning that we didn't have the bandwidth to get to. In Montana, we found out we had grassroots zoning. We had citizen-initiated zoning districts, which are a completely different animal than all the zoning that we were talking about that's government created or initiated. So that warrants a lot more research too. And gosh, we'd be happy to partner with any groups that want to dive into that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the collective wisdom of your team. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to Diana, who organized the event. And if anyone is contributing, like Jason is, in the effort to build out a national zoning atlas, please do reach out through our website at zoningatlas.org or follow us on social media. We're always looking for contributors, teams, and funding. And in recent news, the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas just launched yesterday. That's our third one. And you can also check that out on zoningatlas.org. So with that, I guess I'll call it to a close. Thanks again, Kendall, and look forward to seeing what happens next in Montana.
Thank you.